All right, and I'm still not sure what we're going to be talking about. Did you get that? You got that Google sheet, and I've been adding a bunch of claims just around this whole, you know, whole ideas and ideologies of CRT and critical social justice. And I've just been adding a bunch of claims, and I've got a bunch of your confidences so far. That's really great.
Okay.
But I still don't. How should this conversation go? What would you guys like to do?
What do you say, Andrew?
Well, I kind of when you and I were talking about it, Dusty, I know it seemed like maybe you wanted to do like SE on Dusty and I about CRT, and Dusty and I were talking about how maybe it would be a good idea to go through some of the definitions and some of the questions on the questionnaire, because it seems like maybe some of our answers are so different because we have different definitions of some of the terms.
Right. And there's also just the effect of this labeling of CRT. I live in Virginia, so I don't know if you know what's going on.
Saw what happened, yesterday.
Yeah, so basically because of CRT, we have Glenn Youngkin here as our governor. And it really upsets me, not because I'm like super pro CRT or anything like that. It's just because of what has been labeled as CRT, we had like a lot of enthusiasm for, Republicans to come out and vote. But I think just my main issue with it is, call it what it is. If you want to call it wokeness or whatever the hell you want to call it, go ahead and call it that. It's just that CRT itself is not what everybody thinks it is. It's pretty insular and not really, it's not something that's going to be taught in schools. So it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of like banging my head when I see like these interviews of voters going to the polls. It's like, yeah, CRT, I don't want to, the main reason I'm voting is because, CRT. And then they ask them, well, what's CRT? Is like, I don't know what CRT is, but I know it's bad.
It teaches kids to hate America.
Yeah, or something like that. Like I have criticisms against all those people that people have criticisms about, but it's, if you say wokeness instead of CRT, I wonder like how big of a draw it would have come of that. Because when you use CRT, it's like, okay, it kind of reminds me of Gamergate, where one side was, hey, what's with all of this like favoritism and corruption and cronyism in games journalism, and then one side is like, no, it's about harassing women and yada yada yada. It's like, okay, like your side is pretty riled up for something that's not even what we're talking about over here. So it's, I don't know, man, it's just kind of gotten out of hand, and it does, like, the conversation has political ramifications. Like it's definitely does.
Certainly, yeah. That's part of the problem too. They like in terms of a few things that you mentioned there, like we were talking about how people like Robin DiAngelo in her books like White Fragility, and Ibram X. Kennedy in his books like How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Ta-Nehisi Coates in his books like Between the World and Me. That stuff is not really CRT. It's not critical race theory, or at best it's like wacko fringe stuff that the overwhelming majority of people who study critical race theory would not classify as critical race theory. And some of these terms like whiteness and intersectionality, the people who are in critical race theory, who people like James Lindsay mention often, like Kimberly Crenshaw, have said that people like Robin DiAngelo use terms like white fragility and intersectionality differently. And I would agree that the stuff that people are labeling as CRT is mostly more like wokeness, because it's a whole bunch of different things, like focusing on race, class, gender, identity, politics, all that kind of shit. Critical race theory is almost entirely people talking just about race, and it's not the same thing as the things that people conflate it with, like it's not critical theory, it's not Marxism, it's not Frankfurt School, it's not postmodernism. These things are all very different realms of academic thought that have little to nothing to do with each other. And you can cherry pick and like find things that people say about certain philosophers, but it's never things that they focus on. And treating critical race theory like it's this one coherent ideology and it's all of these things together, as you say, Dusty, it's not a monolith, and it's being presented by some public intellectuals like James Lindsay as if this fringe wacko shit is like the entirety of critical race theory, and it's this monolith.
Yeah, and there's even when we're talking about the woke people, and when I mean woke people, just like the non-academic people who talk about race. So we're talking about D'Angelo and Ibram X. Kendi, people like that. So just take a look at two people. All right, let's take a look at two people that me and Andrew probably don't agree with most of the time, which would be, I know you haven't read Ibram yet, Andrew, but we can agree that Robin DiAngelo does explicitly say things and say she believes in like the power plus privilege race theory of racism, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard that in that read. So the interesting thing is I've been reading some Ibram X. Kendi just to see what he's about. And I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but he is explicitly against the power plus privilege theory. He has a whole chapter of how black people can be racist. So, like, even
Right.
outside of CRT, these people are not agreeing with each other on what is racist, who can be racist, and things like that. So we have this white lady, D'Angelo, who says, all white people are racist, and you have this black dude, Kendi, is like, no, black people can definitely be racist, and they can definitely vote against their own interest by voting for racist policies. So it's not like even outside of CRT, the thought isn't monolithic. So it's not, they're not all saying the same things.
And like the term racism in particular, like you were just saying, is defined in a lot of different ways. Like even those people like D'Angelo and Kennedy, and then if you go back to the original critical race theorists, like the study of critical theory, there's disagreement within those people about what racism means, but a lot of the time it's not defined the way that people like Robin DiAngelo define it, as like power plus privilege, or that all white people are always inevitably racist against black people and you can't stop it, but you still should simultaneously always be trying to stop it. It's more like kind of a sociological analysis of racism as kind of a collection of sociological factors that lead to disproportionate outcomes with particularly lower class black people in the American criminal justice system, for example.
Right. It's like pretty insular. Like, I tried to study CRT as much as I could, but most of the texts are not mainstream at all. A lot of it's textbooks and papers and essays written by legal professors. That's like the vast majority of what CRT is. And I've read outside of CRT, and that stuff is mostly written by non-legal people. It's just like Kendi, what is he, a historian? And I think D'Angelo's, was a professor in like critical whiteness studies or something like that.
Yeah. And now she makes all her money from teaching like diversity sensitivity training, and now Ta-Nehisi Coates he writes for Marvel.
Yeah, so I think it's just all of these ideas are being lumped in together under CRT, but they're not. That's so when schools say that they're not teaching CRT, they're not teaching it. What are they teaching? I don't know what you want to call it. Like, I don't know what you want to call the 1619 or whatever the hell that thing's called. Like, that's not
1619 project?
Yeah, that's not CRT. It's
Yeah.
just some journalist's reimagination of history. I don't know really what you would want to call that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to like differentiate some of these claims. And yeah, so I put a link into the Google Doc again. If you go to the Google or the Google Sheet, go there and then go to the data filter views and filter by CRT. I guess we're talking about CRT right now.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a few claims I'd like to get like very like more specific claims around some of these.
Where did you just post that here?
In the Zoom
It's
chat.
in the chat.
Okay.
And it should be the editable link.
Okay.
Let's start with these three claims that I've highlighted. If you go to data filter views, CRT.
Okay.
So the ones at the top here, you mean, or which ones?
If you filter them by CRT tag, go to data filter views, CRT. I've highlighted three claims. I'd like to get your confidence about those.
Okay.
Okay. Filter. Sorry, where do I go to in through filter to filter it by CRT?
Data filter views.
Data filter views.
Oh, I went to filter first.
CRT.
That's why. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then CRT.
Okay. So yeah, I got it filtered.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, do you see me highlighting these three claims? College level CRT, simplified CRT,
I see one highlighted that says college level CRT.
just one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I see clicking around
Oh,
there.
yeah.
college level CRT and simplified CRT. What
Yeah.
was the third one there?
CRT is being applied in K through 12 schools.
Okay.
So kind of get your confidence about those.
So-
You have a column for confidence.
Well, I'll
yeah.
say this regarding K through 12. My wife is a K through 12 teacher, so I know there's been a lot of claims about the NEA forcing their teachers or something to teach CRT. So because I have a wife who's gets these materials, I actually have a copy of their newsletter, and I read it, and they have a couple of lesson plans teaching. They don't call it CRT, they call it something else. But the lesson plan was about looking at voter suppression, historical voter suppression, and then sparking some type of class conversation about it. Throughout the whole thing that I read, there was nothing about hatred of white people or even singling out white people for anything specifically. And like I said, CRT is pretty high level stuff. They weren't according to what I looked at, they're definitely not teaching K through 12 kids this, because this is graduate level law school stuff. So I don't know how that could apply specifically to K through 12. So as far as I could tell, no. Like, most teachers don't even read these newsletters. My wife didn't. I just saw it in the mail, and I asked her, "Are you going to read this?" She's like, "I don't read those things." So I was like, "Okay." I snatched it up, and it's like, "Okay, this is pretty juicy. Let's
Right.
see what we could find out here about what they're telling teachers to teach." And even though this is a teachers union, so they don't make local policy, they don't make state policy. They're more like an advocacy group, but they don't have the power to actually enact policy or anything like that. So,
Okay.
yeah, even then, I took a look at the stuff that they were trying to teach in the lessons plans, and it looks pretty benign to me. Yeah, like if there was something that, tried to make students feel that they should look at white kids and feel some animosity, there was nothing there that talked about white people in a whole sense. So
Right.
it was really strange to me. And then most of it was examining history, the lesson plans themselves. So they were talking about like Jim Crow era stuff, and so I was like, this seems pretty benign to me. It seems like even the teachers union, I think in some of their notes, they were trying to defend CRT, and the stuff they were defending wasn't even CRT to begin with. So it seems like they're confused too as whether what CRT is, even though I took a
Yeah.
look at it and I was like, yeah, none of this is CRT. So, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
That's one of the problems we talked about before, that it doesn't seem like most people in general, whether they're against or for CRT, bother to like actually read up on it. So people who are super pro CRT, like basically parrot the claims that are actually kind of straw men of what the claims actually are. Also, in terms of what I was saying earlier, with respect to definitions, with those three claims that you highlighted, Reed, the first one is college level CRT is being taught in K to 12 schools, and then simplified CRT is being taught in K to 12 schools, and then CRT is being applied in K to 12 schools. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you mean by simplified CRT as opposed to college level CRT, and I'm not sure what you mean by being applied as opposed to being taught.
Yeah. Let me think. There is the broad identity politics of CRT, which is the oppressor versus the oppressed type framework. And I've seen that idea be implemented in K through 12 curriculum. And that is causing division. So that would be something that would be simplified. Like there's a more complicated theory around that with intersectionality in college level CRT, and then CRT being applied in K through 12 schools. It's like you get that privilege walk type of thing where you take a step forward if you have this identity characteristic, take a step back if you have this identity characteristic, and then kids in the schools can very clearly see where they rank in the hierarchy of privilege and oppression.
Okay. So
yeah, it's like oppression is not something it's like if you think about comparisons of oppression versus not oppression, that's very broad, and it touches upon
that's not
many
really
different.
That's not really a CRT thing either.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say.
Yeah, that's just kind of a broad left-wing ideal type of thing. It doesn't originate in CRT, and if I'm thinking about it, what are the aims of CRT? To point out discrepancies. I'm not sure if I remember from reading if they couch it in terms of oppression. Maybe we might see that in, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates and you know, Kendi and people like that. But when I was reading like the academic CRT stuff, it's mostly about trying to point out things in the legal system that the meritocracy kind of obscures, and how if our system is truly meritocratic, why do we still have these things occurring? So that's what they're trying to figure out. They're saying basically the law appears neutral on the books, but for some reason there's still these odd discrepancies that people, after doing studies in certain areas, are still not able to fully ascribe as being something that racism is not a factor. So one of the things is too, it's not, I think the reason that CRT is solely focused on race is because that's just particularly that tool. They're not saying, okay, don't use economic models, don't use evolutionary biology models. They're saying, hey, this is something you can use in conjunction with everything else. So like the argument of saying, oh, only view things through the lens of race, that's just one tool of many in which you could view the world. Like, I read a bunch of other ways that people view the world, and I don't just choose one of them, and that defines the entire worldview or lens in which I look at things. It's just one tool of many to take a look and try to compare analysis with. So I guess, yeah, if you're afraid of creating ideologues without presenting these other tools, yeah, that could possibly happen. But I'm not seeing anywhere where, okay, let's look at math and forms of race. Let's look at physics.
Yeah.
That's just not happening. There's definitely different lenses in which we're taught. You know, I know there's probably some stupid studies out there that try to do that. I've seen some super ridiculous things like, oh yeah, we should not look at science and then look at witchcraft to find our answers, or like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Like, I'm gonna tell you that right now. It's like colonialism. There were some definite like pluses from being colonized. Like, colonialism isn't all bad. Like, there was an exchange of culture. We got, you know, the good stuff from colonialism, and we also combined that with whatever was colonized, or, you know, the people who were colonized. So I don't get this one-sided view of trying to take like this minuscule lens and try to apply it to every single thing. I don't know. Nobody operates like that, and if they do, they're just wacky and stupid. Like, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah.
So Andrew,
I think
you're
like
10%.
you said, most.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. What numbers would you have put on those claims, Dusty?
I didn't answer that one. I don't think. I don't think I got to that one because I went through it once and then I didn't get back to it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, so you're 10%, Andrew, for simplified CRTs being taught in K through 12 schools. What would you need to see to raise your confidence about it?
I think like basically, because I changed my answer from 1% to 10% for that one and for the next one because of it seems like from the way you phrased the questions that simplified CRT is different from CRT, and based on what you described, maybe something like oppressor versus oppressed is being taught somewhere, but I wouldn't really classify that as CRT. But at least like that sort of specific claim could be perhaps taught somewhere. And if you mean CRT being applied rather than taught, I guess maybe I would actually have a lower answer for that one than the one before. Maybe more like 5%, because maybe in the example you described, like step forward if you're this certain race or something like that, you could say that. But then again, I wouldn't classify that as CRT either. So I think I would actually change my answer on that to 5%. And yeah, like all this stuff like that, like step forward if you're this race. Oh, all you white people, you are inherently more privileged than black people, or something like that. That's not really anything to do with critical race theory. That's some like woke, I don't know, like Robin DiAngelo or Ta-Nehisi Coates type shit. Like one of the books by Derek Bell, who's one of the critical race theorists who James Lindsay mentions, for example. It's about I believe it's the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case that desegregated black schools from white schools. And basically his main thesis in that book is that this was kind of this desegregating black schools was actually kind of a mistake, at least in the way it was implemented, because it ended up resulting in the way it was implemented in kind of having most poor black kids still going to primarily black schools, and most white kids, particularly middle-class white kids, going to mostly white schools. So he thinks that they should have emphasized the separate but equal aspect of that. The equal part of it should have been way more important than the separate part, and that it might have even been a better idea to focus on making black schools up to par with the performance standards and like access to tools and learning abilities and that sort of thing, like have the ones in black schools up to par with the stuff in white schools.
Gotcha. So there's a bunch of other claims on here that we might disagree with. What is another claim we should talk about?
Well, look at the greens and reds and see which ones have the most differences.
Yeah. Like Ibrahim X. Kennedy is an authority on CRT. I think we kind of already talked about how that's certainly not true. Like, I only put 10% because I like to kind of err on the side of being hesitant just in case I'm wrong, other than the stuff that I'm like almost 100% certain about. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't see, like Dusty was saying, even Ibrahim X. Kennedy disagrees with Robin DiAngelo, so you couldn't even say that either of them are authorities on CRT, really.
Yeah, I think Robin DiAngelo is maybe closer to CRT, but she's not a lawyer, and she's not, because that stuff's only taught in grad school for like lawyers that are trying to become civil rights lawyers. So I don't know how that relates to Robin DiAngelo.
And she's like all about teaching people to not be racist and teaching white people to feel guilty about racism. Like, that's not really anything that critical race theorists do. It's not about teaching white people to feel guilty all the time for their racism. It's about kind of addressing what could have caused these problems and possible ways to do things differently rather than the way they've been done.
Maybe I'll add this claim. Ibram X. Kendi is a good authority on anti-racism policy, and Robin DiAngelo is a good authority on anti-racism policy.
Well, I know Andrew hasn't read Kendi. A good authority.
I'm just going
it's
based
weird.
Off of,
like, he's an authority. I don't know.
That's why I added the good there.
Yeah, the good
I might
part.
agree that he's an
I don't know.
authority.
I disagree with many things that he says. I just think he's too like the way that he speaks about policy is kind of you're with us or against us. There's no middle ground with that guy. which is kind of the same vein of D'Angelo, where she's trying to create dividing lines between groups. With Kendi, though, he's less about the color of people. He's more about what policies do these people support. And depending on what the policy is, will determine whether that person's a racist or not. I think that's a better look at it rather than your skin color determines whether you're racist or not.
Yeah,
At least in Ibram X. Kendi's way, you have a choice on whether to be racist. Robin DiAngelo, you have no choice. So
yeah,
I'd say X. Kendi's a better authority. Is he good? I don't think he's that good at actually broadening the conversation to people who might be more moderate. Not really good on that front, but he's better than Robin DiAngelo. Robin DiAngelo is just ridiculous. Like, yeah. Kendi can be ridiculous too. Like, one of the stupid anecdotes I was reading about in his book, he was in these. A lot of his rhetoric is based on anecdote more than study. He does cite some statistics, but a lot of it is anecdotal. So I remember
I'm pretty sure it's all anecdotal with Robin DiAngelo too.
Yeah, it was a while since we read that, but man, it was such a cringy book. So
yeah.
So How to Be Anti-Racist is the book I'm reading right now.
Oh boy.
I'm almost done, but yeah, there's just some stupid anecdotes. Like, one of them was he was talking about his childhood and schooling, and how supposedly black schools are no more violent or safe than white schools. And the anecdote he used was, "Oh yeah, some thug in my class pulled a gun on me, but I'm still here. He pulled a gun on my face, but nobody got hurt." I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I've never gone to a school where I had a gun pointed at my face. Like, you got to think of what kind of psychological trauma. Like, you don't have to be shot. If someone pulls a gun and points it at your head, that's going to have an impact. I don't think Ibram X. Kendi is kind of realizing that there's probably some psychological impact from someone pointing a gun in his face and pointing it at his ribs. And then the guy's like, "Oh, are you scared?" And he's like, "Oh, no. I'm not scared." It's like, oh man, this is some BS.
I'd be fucking scared. Holy shit.
Yeah, I was like, dude, that's like the worst anecdote to show that white schools are no more violent than black schools, or vice versa. That's ridiculous, man.
Yeah, there's two claims I've heard from that the anti-racism book. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination.
I must not have gotten to that part, but I would definitely disagree with that. Mm-hmm. But I haven't gotten to it. So
that's also not something in actual critical race theory texts in any of the ones that I've read, or any of the authors that we've mentioned. Like, none of them are pro discrimination in any sense.
And how old is how new is the newest accurate source on CRT? Is it only things that happened in the 90s, in the 80s, late 80s, or is there still stuff going on today?
There are more recent stuff, recent compilations of different authors, and there are still new academic books coming out. Like, I think that one by Derek Bell that I mentioned, I think it came out in 2008 or so, and some of it, I think some of it probably came out within.
Like, the actual textbooks get updated. So one of the ones I reread was updated to include, stuff about the Donald Trump's presidency. So,
these are what are some good sources to just get a general overview of the actual CRT?
Good. Just go to the Wikipedia article and scroll all the way down, and you'll see a bunch of books by those authors. A lot of them are hard to get because, like I said, they're textbooks, but all of those authors cited down at the bottom are the CRT authors that,
Yeah,
that kind of
and
founded the theory.
and that textbook that both of us read is just called Critical Race Theory. And then Derek Bell is a well-known author who I mentioned for that. His book Silent Covenant, and then or Silent Covenants, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And there's also one that's on intersectionality. And if you just search these terms like critical race theory and intersectionality and these different authors, a lot of them will come up on. There's this website called archive.org that has at least a few of those different books, and you can take them out for a few weeks like any other library.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, any other claims to discuss?
Well, I think like one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that this is like kind of one of my pet peeves is when critical race theory gets lumped in together with all of these other realms of academic thought that I mentioned, like critical theory and Marxism and postmodernism. And like, for example, the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, all of those people who James Lindsay has mentioned, like Marcuse, for example, and there's a book by Horkheimer and Adorno called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Those authors are just like, they're super Marxist and they're really against the Enlightenment, but they never say anything about race. There's no connection between them and critical race theory. And then postmodernism, for example, like Foucault and Derrida, one of the reasons that I like Foucault is that he writes a lot in his books about how creating categories is a problem. So I think he would really be against the creation of all these endless categories and identity politics and stuff like that, and making it so important to evaluate people based on their race. Because one of his big criticisms in his book called A History of Sexuality is how during the Enlightenment, the institutions of science and religion created this category of homosexuals, which before didn't exist. So it differentiated homosexuals between homosexuals and heterosexuals, and basically religion declared this category of homosexuals as sinful, and science declared this category of homosexual as medically and psychologically flawed. So, and he talks a bit about other controversial categories too, like bisexuals and people like that, and how this endless creation of categories just serves to divide people. And that's not really, and I don't think that Foucault or Derrida would see that as a good thing. And those guys barely talked about race at all either. And they're often labeled as Marxists, even though, like, Foucault, for example, was really more of an anarchist. He said government is the only fatal form of power. And in terms of Marxism in relation to critical theory, the critical theorists were a different type of Marxist from just Marxism in general. And one thing that often seems to happen is people lump all of these different types of Marxism together with critical theory. But the Frankfurt School Marxists, they were very different from other types of Marxists, and they focus on different things. And a lot of them focus mainly on fascism and the Enlightenment, even more so than capitalism in some cases, more so than other types of Marxists. And there are also Marxists who disagree about the level of authority you should apply to things. Like they're even like the most hardcore Stalinists and communists who think that the government should just have authoritarian control over everything in society. And then there are other Marxists who seem to actually be of the majority of them. If you read some of the work by Marxists like David Harvey or Slavoj Žižek, or even Marx himself, according to some lefty people I've talked to, like Ben Burgess, who I talked to recently, say that that they're not for this authoritarian state solution to everything. It's more like the democratic worker control of companies and things like that, more like anarcho-syndicalists or libertarian socialists advocate for, not this authoritarian government control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the model of the history of these ideas and how they evolved from cynical theories, which is pretty interesting to me. Have you read Cynical Theories, either of you?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you think of that model?
I've read it. I had a lot of problems with that and other theories in the book. I mean, it is true that theories and ideas change, but that's one of the things too. Like you can find examples of people who use like one or the other of these different things, like I don't know, like people in intersectionality who mention Foucault here and there, but most of the time they're just mentioning Foucault offhandedly as one of many different examples that have nothing to do with the other examples they're mentioning, or they want to take this theory of Foucault and flip it on its head and approach it from a different reason. And they're basically just doing what philosophers do. They're taking these ideas and they're manipulating them and deconstructing them and building back up to serve their own ideology, regardless of how much merit there is to that theory. So, I mean, you could say that these separate things have more to do with each other than they used to, and you could say that they're different than the way they used to be, but I still think it's phenomenally inaccurate to link all of these ideas together like they share the same ideology, and to say that they've evolved so much to become this like evil ideology. This is one of the things that I've said before, which is that this like wokeness ideology, it's far less coherent. Like people like James Lindsay are giving these people way less credit than they deserve. Like it's not this like conspiracy to Sovietize America or something like that. Like he said on a few podcasts, it's not like that's one of the things that kind of bugs me too. It sounds like a really paranoid conspiracy theory. I don't think anyone's trying to take over America with like postmodern neo-Marxist critical race theory, wokeness, social justice, and all of those labels.
Yeah, wouldn't you say that Sovietism is more like a modernist idea than a postmodern idea? Like,
yeah, certainly.
I guess, like, I'll say this from reading Ibram X. Kendi, he definitely takes some cues from postmodernism. He just has like a kind of stupid way of doing it. Like, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with Foucault's his
biopower.
Yeah, biopower. So Kendi has like his own version of that called racist power, which is basically kind of a stupid carbon copy of it. That's
oh man, I think Foucault would be pissed off about that, man.
Well, yeah, because Foucault's more nuanced about it, because he doesn't say that one side holds all power and everyone under oppression has no power. But actually, because Ibram X. Kendi does use Foucault to criticize the power plus privilege narrative. He actually uses Foucault to criticize that. And I'll tell you.
Oh,
I think it's
that's interesting.
Power plus prejudice is the people's all like power and privilege are the same thing, or like
the
privilege is measured. The level of power is measured by privilege.
Okay.
Level.
Yeah. So he does attack that premise by using Foucaultian ideas. He doesn't say anything about I was influenced by Foucault, but it's pretty obvious. So he says because people have the power to vote, that means you have power. So anybody who has the power to vote can have some type of power. So when he says that when a black person, for instance, votes for, something that is racist or something like a racist policy, They are actually using their power to vote that way. So saying that nobody has any power, or I think that's kind of Coates's view, right? That no matter what, black people don't have power in the current system that we're in. Like,
I think he and D'Angelo maybe too.
Yeah, so like they all have different ideas, and a lot of their ideas contradict each other. So it's weird. You kind of have to examine each of these people and what they're saying, because some of them are completely contrary to each other. So when they all lump these things in together, it just kind of gives me a headache, because I'm thinking of all these contradictory ideas that these people are talking about, and I'm like, which one of these ideas are people? Like, I understand criticizing, the racism being a product of privilege, and the black people can't be racist. Like, that's D'Angelo and her group. You have other groups that are saying like this is nonsense. And to be honest, I haven't really. I know there's one of the main claims this election was, okay, we're teaching people to hate America, and I try to find examples of what does this mean exactly. Because if you read CRT, I don't know how any of this would teach someone to hate America, so to speak. But when we're talking about hate America, are we talking like Russian propaganda or something, or what are we talking about here? Because I think that was one of the things you have put on the list, is that CRT teaches people to hate America or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess also, my only thing would be, what would be considered hate of America? Like, how do you define that?
Yeah.
The classic American values are like, the American dream. If you work hard enough, you can get to a better life than where you started. Like meritocracy, capitalism is good, private property is good, individualism is good. Judge people by the content of their character, stuff like that.
Okay, so just thinking about CRT, they don't really talk about. So let's start with content of character and judging people based off of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think CRT is in the field of judging individuals. So there is no tenet that says, look at this individual. It's all about systems analysis and legal systems analysis. So I understand that part of it. I would say there are probably Robin DiAngelo definitely doesn't believe in that. So, but I don't consider her CRT at all. But CRT itself, if we're talking about, are they still okay? One of the things I do know is that CRT doesn't say that Martin Luther King was a bad person, or that he was not effective. At the time that he lived, he was effective. So what they're saying in CRT specifically is that even after Martin Luther King, there are still some things that can be looked at that weren't solved by the civil rights era in the 60s. So they're not saying that, let's not judge people based off of their character. It's more about looking at what things are still lingering after the civil rights era that weren't corrected by the civil rights era. So that's pretty much what it's about.
Yeah, and in terms of like individualism and meritocracy and that kind of thing, I mean, like, it's more of to me it's more of just a nuanced take. It's not that the individual doesn't matter. It's that there are also systemic problems like the drug war I mentioned, for example, with disproportionate outcomes, and that, maybe, capitalism and meritocracy are valuable, but they're not perfect. They have flaws just like every other thing, and perhaps there could be other sort of ways of addressing some problems with capitalism without totally throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Like, you don't have to be an anti-capitalist to be a critical race or anything like that. And wanting to address things that haven't been addressed yet is kind of the motivation behind that, is to increase the ability for people to be able to live in a meritocracy. It's not anything like that. People do not live in anything even remotely close to a meritocracy, and we need to basically form a society based on putting people in positions of power based on the proportion of their race in society or anything like that. And also to go back to what we were saying about Foucault's definition of power, it's like he doesn't talk about the oppressor versus the oppressed, or then that's one thing that people get wrong a lot too. Foucault explicitly says in a lot of his writing, like A History of Sexuality and some of his essays and other books, that he is not saying that power is always bad or it's this inherently bad thing. He looks at it more like a tool. It can be good or bad depending on what you use it for. There can be people in power who use their power in a bad way to take advantage of people, or there can be people with or without power who use their power in a good way to change things for the better. Like, one example that I've used before is, because Foucault and particularly Derrida talk about language a lot, is the N-word, how it used to pretty much be exclusively used by white people as a racist term towards black people, but then early hip hop artists in the 80s, they kind of like use their power to change the meaning of this word in a way so that if you say, like, rappers can say the N-word in a slightly different way than the more racist way it was said before, and it can be actually like a positive word, like this is my guy over here, or those other guys aren't as rich as me. Like, that's basically the way that rappers use it in songs. So it could be, well, and now like, it's a taboo for white people to say that word in public. Like, I can't even say that live without getting punished for it somehow. So that has certainly changed, and that's a way of an example of power being used for good. So it's not, like I said, he looks at power as more of like a tool, not necessarily an inherently or good or bad thing. And it's also not the only thing that he cares about or focuses on too. He's looking at a lot of different things, like postmodernists or post-structuralists. They're all about looking at the institutions of the modern era, like science and religion, like I mentioned, and schools and government and all those sort of things. And it's about analyzing them. It's not about trying to bring them down and engineer a revolution or any shit like that. It's more analytical rather. It's descriptive. It's not prescriptive.
Yeah. I know probably Reed will probably have a criticism, because I know there's a quote that goes around, and I've read the quote from the book that it came from, which is CRT seeks to bring down the liberal order. I'm sure you've heard that before.
It questions it. Yeah,
questions it. So
that's what they say.
Questions.
So
well, that could be true.
Well, what it's doing, well, at least what it's questioning is like the post-civil rights era, and how much progress is being made in trying to remove these inequities. So when we talk about meritocracy, we talk about how much well, we can always strive to be a better meritocracy. So what I think in CRT, what they criticize is that, yeah, it's not there yet. Yeah, we're not a meritocracy yet. I think there's very few instances in which you can describe a meritocratic system having taken place. I know blind audition for a symphony is probably the most meritocratic thing that we do, because you have no idea who this person is. You can only hear their actual work. But in any other instance, when we bring on employees or hire people, or even, I think college probably does a little better job when they do like blind admissions and they don't look at any of the background of who they're looking at. But when you're getting employed, there's no way to remove particular biases when you're going to hire somebody. It's just almost impossible, unless you're just going to solely focus on the work that they're doing. But most of it is about challenging whether the current order of meritocracy is actually working to solve some of these problems. So I don't think they're trying to, turn the country into communism. They're just questioning the status quo, basically. That's all I see it as, what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Where is this quote?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's like...
Is this are you showing us a quote from Cynical Theories? Or
This is from Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, Critical Race Theory and Introduction.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's going to be like in the first like chapter.
Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law.
Well, that's a weird quote, because if you go, I don't know what chapter it is, Derek Bell actually embraces incrementalism. So, yeah, it's not like a...
That's one of his. That's
like
one of his main
thing.
criticisms. That's one of his main criticisms of black school desegregation. That people assume that you could do this one simple fix, and he basically thought that it would have been better to have a more incremental approach to it.
Yeah, so it's certainly, like I said, some of this stuff is contradictory. So depending, if you don't read like a lot of it, it's just you're just gonna read like a little blurb and see that you don't see the dissenting voices and opinions. And even within this own book, there's dissenting opinions regarding incrementalism.
Yeah, that's why I said like I think it's more helpful to look at it as a philosophy, even though it's not a philosophy, because it doesn't have like it's in the realm of philosophy in the way that, like, if you compare to, I don't know, empiricism, for example, you can find a whole bunch of different empiricists, and they're going to have a whole bunch of different opinions or different definitions of empiricism. This guy will say this is empiricism. John Locke will say this is empiricism. Another guy will say, no, this is empiricism. This guy is wrong about empiricism. And they're all labeled empiricists because they have like maybe one common sort of thing that they're focusing on, like what you observe is supposed to directly reflect the world, and that can tell you what is true. And like in the same way that, I mean, one of the only things that you could say about critical race theorists is that they study race and try to figure out how outcomes occurred. You could maybe say a few other things, but yeah.
Yeah, because regarding the incrementalism too, what Derek Bell specifically said was that if you don't use an incremental approach, that's just going to create a lot of negative backlash on the other end of the political spectrum. So he advocates to use incremental approaches, because when you get super radical and really pushy about things, you get like this other side coming back even more forcefully. It's just like what we're seeing today, where some people are pushing stuff really hard, and then you get a really enthusiastic counter force that may not be super informed about it, but it's still creating a big counter force in order to push back on what's going on. So there's like different opinions, and when I was looking at some of these different opinions, it's like, well, yeah, it's really hard to define CRT, since there's a lot of disagreement, but there's, in all the similarities, it's basically they're all trying to critique systems in the form looking through a lens of racism and discrimination, but there's a lot of different opinions within that. And when I think of CRT, it's considered a legal theory, so it's definitely in the realm of legal jurisprudence, and that is in itself, it's called the theory of law, and the theory of law does fall more into a philosophical realm than anything else.
Yeah, for sure.
You would say CRT is merely a legal theory still today?
Well, it falls under legal theory, and legal theory, if we're talking about what is legal theory or what is jurisprudence, legal theory is the philosophy of law. So it's a very broad category, but it's when we're talking about CRT, it's pretty clearly defined as a type of legal theory.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I assume maybe I'm just confused.
Like, I think...
Well, that's where the theory comes from. That's where the T in CRT comes from. It's within a legal theory.
Yeah. There's a huge difference between like discussing something about race and full-on critical race theory. If you teach kids, okay, so let's talk about the Civil War. There were different opinions on it. Some people say it was about slavery. Some people say it was about states' rights. And it used to be the case that maybe the aspect of slavery was less taught. And historically speaking, both of those things are true depending on which part of the Civil War you're looking at. Or if you talk about like racially disproportionate outcomes of the drug war, for example, like neither of those things are necessarily a critical race theory. They're just kind of a more nuanced view of history.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because when you're talking about critical race theory, it's more foundational. Like you're trying to get more at the roots of that theory and the foundations of the theory. So when we're talking about like law philosophy, it's more about the foundations. And when you're talking about philosophy in general, we're talking about the foundations of thought. So CRT is about the foundations of legal theory in relation to race. So it doesn't really apply to what a lot of people are calling CRT. We can call it something else, and there's criticisms to be made about that something else, but it is a something else.
What about like cultural stereotypes? Is that a part of legal theory, or is it something different?
Well, I know they address some of that, likely, but you can't really legislate that, so I'm not sure how that. I know if you're arguing a case, which is what a lot of CRT is about, presenting this stuff in the courtroom and trying to argue a case, you can of course use cultural stereotypes as evidence of a discrepancy, but that's what it would be. It would be the use of that as evidence. I wouldn't say it's you can. That's what it is. it's not like, oh, we created this particular thing in CRT, but they would use that as a form of evidence to present. Because a lot of what CRT does, it teaches civil rights lawyers how to be civil rights activists. That's basically what it is from what I've read. I don't know. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I would say so. That sounds pretty accurate.
Yeah, and it has an activist dimension to it, which is different from
there's
what
definitely
Andrew
an
was saying.
activist dimension to it.
It's different from the
Yeah,
postmodernists who were
yeah.
merely descriptive and not activists. Or is that fair to say?
Yeah, and that's another thing. That's another thing that's different among different critical race theories. Like some of them focus on activism. Some of them focus on exploring race as a social construct. Most of them still just focus on legal theory. So the ones who are activists, that's like one of the many different separate types of critical race theorists, and then the ones who focus on legal theory and examining race as a social construct, like they're against using activism to solve their goals. They're just more about kind of thinking about and analyzing these ideas, so they're more analytical too. So it's also like activism is part of it, but it's not necessarily like an inherent part of critical racism or critical race theory in general.
Mm-hmm. So if we're defining CRT as this specific domain in legal theory, let's just broaden it out to wokeness in general, and wokeness applying has its own ideology and has its own theory of what causes problems and prescriptions for solving those problems. There's a race element of wokeness that might be that's probably we would define as different from CRT.
I would say wokeness is more almost entirely activist. Like there's no really thought or analysis about things. It's like, let's do something and act on it and create like these crazy scenarios and things that most people don't think about.
They probably hate an incrementalist like Derek Bell if they read his work.
Yeah, they're like, they probably wouldn't like Derek Bell because exactly he's an incrementalist. So I don't know, like the wokeness, like I don't agree with most of it. Like I'll say,
yeah, me neither. Yeah,
Ibram X. Kendi is pretty damn woke. But I read his book. There's a lot I disagree with, but there's some stuff there that I thought was pretty helpful, like him trying to dispel the black people can't be racist myth that some woke people expound. Like I was like, yeah, he said something great, and I'd actually like advocate that part of what he's talking about the most.
Yeah,
it's like, look, this
that's
guy's
like
woke
against
and he's
wokeness.
Yeah.
What does he mean by racist? Does he mean like perpetuate a system of oppression, or hold views related to like the quality of character
yeah
thing?
Specifically, there's only two. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. You're one of those two things. And what determines whether you're a racist or an anti-racist is which policies you advocate and vote for. So that's his definition of who is a racist and who's anti-racist. And he even admits himself that sometimes he's supported racist policies. So it's almost as if you can be both. So I don't really understand the dichotomy that he espouses, but his is like, it's a straight thing down the middle. You're either racist if you vote for this type of policy, and if you don't, then you're an anti-racist. But it's not really clear which policies are racist or anti-racist. It's like, that's pretty much an opinion. So it's not really super
like
concrete.
Like a lot of the critical race theorists who we're talking about, I don't recall any of them actually using the term anti-racist. And I don't think like some of them probably do, but I haven't seen any of them who say that you're either racist or you're an anti-racist. I think most of them have a more nuanced view than that. And that's why, like, these authors who were mentioning, like Robin DiAngelo, and Ibram X. Kennedy and Ta-Nehisi Coates, like, they couldn't necessarily be classified as anti-racist, or at best they're like the wacko fringe.
Gotcha. So yeah, that's my main focus now, is understanding wokeness and understanding the problems it's causing in schools and other institutions.
Yeah.
Culture.
Yeah, I think we agree that wokeness is causing problems. I just think that wokeness is a collection of, kind of like what Dusty was saying, it's kind of a collection of a lot of different contradictory ideas, bits and pieces of a lot of different ideologies that they're weaving together in this totally incoherent political and philosophical ideology, where they're just saying all of these catchphrases and trying to put them into activism in the absolute most extreme and annoying ways possible that it's hard to imagine anyone can agree with.
Yeah, and it's like so jargon laden that it's like most people just don't know what the hell they're talking about. Like they'll try to say, "Oh, this is from Foucault," and then they totally misunderstand what it is that they're saying, and then they've created this new thing, which is wokeness, which in some sense, like a lot of what they say is anti-Foucault, because if Foucault saw some of the stuff they say, he would just like face palm himself to death. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, go to data filter views and click on philosophy, because wokeness has fundamental assumptions, like philosophical assumptions, and I'd be interested to see if we disagree on any of the, like, some of these assumptions are woke, I would categorize, which come from postmodernism or critical theory, and some I disagree with, some I agree with. So it would be that might be another, either we do it now or some other time we can, really go down on these philosophical assumptions. That would be fun.
So which ones, which was the first one you were highlighting there?
Philosophy.
I did that. Cultural context, construct our perspectives on the self, the other, and the world. That was the first one you had there?
Let me sort by, I'll just sort by my confidence. So there we go.
Okay, so knowledge is nothing more than a cultural artifact. That's the first one you had highlighted there?
Let's see. Let's see if I can find a good core assumption. Yeah, it is. Yeah, let's go to. Yeah, how about this? Knowledge is nothing more than a cultural artifact.
I would say that Foucault would definitely not say that, but like woke people probably would.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that Foucault would say something more like knowledge is culturally contingent, but that doesn't mean it's just a cultural artifact. And like he would say that probably something more like it's historically and culturally contingent. It's shaped by a lot of different factors. Knowledge can change throughout history depending on these different factors, like how we discover new scientific truths that we thought were true before. We thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and then our knowledge changed about it, so that we discovered new knowledge, or not the universe, our galaxy rather. So we discovered that the new knowledge that our sun is actually the center of the universe. So I think it'd be more something like that.
Yeah, actually filter by epistemology. Maybe that would even go break it down even clearer.
Okay.
That would be good.
Okay.
All right.
Anything there
authentic lived experience cannot be faked.
Is that the one I see highlighted right now? Is objective reality cannot be known?
Yeah, I want to
Okay.
let's talk
I
about
would
that.
say that I would say it looks like we have Dusty and I almost totally agreed with this, and you almost totally disagreed with this, Reed. So I think that's actually something that maybe the woke people would actually agree with Foucault on, but um, objective read. Well, I'm not sure. I know the woke people would. I'm not sure Foucault would say objective reality cannot be known. I'd say I'm 90% sure because I'm aware that it's a paradox to say it's impossible for objective reality to be known because that itself is an objective truth claim, which is why I doubt that it can be known, but I think it's a possibility.
Hmm. Maybe we're just not using objective the same way. I don't mean objective as in like absolute certainty. It's just something related to the quality of a model. Like a high quality model can get us closer to reality than less quality models.
That's subjective?
Yeah, like it's not like a exact match of the map to the territory. We just have different quality maps, and that difference in quality we can get above some threshold, and that we call objective.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say
So,
that
could you
one
give me-
claim is more truthful than the other. I know there's this thing it's like, oh, all claims are equally true. That's no, I don't believe that at all.
No. Foucault was not a relativist. Postmodernists weren't. They were pluralists, more like Jonathan Haidt. Like there can be many different ways to reach truth or morality or something. Ironically, I've mentioned this before. I think this is one thing that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris were agreeing about in that famous long debate they had about truth. I think Foucault would actually agree with Jordan Peterson's pluralistic view on truth, which is that there can be scientific truths, there can be religious truths, there can be moral truths, philosophical truths, and there are different kinds of truth. It doesn't mean that scientific truth is just as valid as religious truth. It depends on what we're talking about. Like, you don't want to use a religious truth to conduct scientific studies, but science probably doesn't have anything to do with what's going on if you're going to church on a Sunday, if you happen to be religious. And there can be religious truths that are scientifically false and vice versa, which and some of those annoy me too, but it doesn't necessarily mean that religious claim that's scientifically false is just as valid as the scientific claim, but it's not that they're all relative either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down maybe at some other time. I'd love to talk about that maybe sometime.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we've gone almost 90 minutes. Anything to wrap up?
I would just say that like critical theory in general, it's like what it is a lot more nuanced than the way it's often presented, and there are a lot of different types of critical race theory. People disagree about the definitions of stuff like that. I wouldn't necessarily say that these popular authors we mentioned are Robin DiAngelo and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kennedy are even actually talking about critical race theory, and if they are, it's like wacko fringe stuff at best. But that doesn't mean that critical race theory is the way to solve all the world's problems or anything like that either. And I think that when I've talked about this before, one of the things that I say is that the reason that I criticize people talking about critical race theory and all of these other realms of thought is that, well, I don't agree with any of them completely. I think that there's some merit to them. Even the more radical ideas, like a lot of Foucault and Derrida's ideas are really interesting. A lot of the ideas in critical race theory are more surprising and different than you would expect them to be. And if you investigate even the evil Marxism more, you'll see that they disagree a lot, and a lot of what they say is different from what you would expect. And even who I would classify as the most radical people, like the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, I disagree with them the most, but I like even investigating even radical ideas like that book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, for example. Their thesis was that the Enlightenment is a mistake and it's inherently anti-Semitic, which I think sounds ridiculous, but I also like investigating ridiculous claims like that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I just say, investigate the boogeyman, as Dusty likes to say.
Yeah, well, I had to, because it's in my neck of the woods, and I was just hearing that all day on the news. Like, Jesus Christ, what's going on here? Let me see what these people are saying and whether they got it right or not. And, I do have some agreements with the people that are criticizing what they might introduce in schools. Like, I was looking over the written form of was 1619 Project. It's like, this doesn't belong in elementary school at all. This maybe in high school, if you're teaching like an AP or IB course, you can probably introduce that, but this is not something you really should teach unless you're going to teach something equally like a counter narrative, because it's definitely like very political and one-sided when I read it. And yeah, I wouldn't agree for them to teach something like that. But is it CRT? No, it's not CRT. But hey, if you say I don't want the 1619 in my school, hey, I agree with you. But if you're going to pursue that, don't pursue it at the level of who has the most authority, which is the governor. Go to your local school boards and tell them not to teach this stuff. Why do you have to go to the governor who's going to try to dictate that for everybody? These different counties and different schools might have different methods of teaching people. I think keep it local is what I mean. Keep it less authoritarian. Let be active in your local districts and pursue it that way. But we don't need to get federal when it comes to dictating who and what should be taught in schools. I think there should be a lot of local control. And it was just weird here in Virginia, because there are a lot of concerned parents on the right side of the coin that they're really concerned that, hey, let's make sure that we have a voice in what is being taught in schools. But the problem with that is, if you're using that for the governor, that's not the right way to do it. Just do it at your local level. Don't force the governor to make these mandates for everybody. Just do it. Take care of your issues locally.
Run for school board.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I wouldn't advocate for anyone going to the president for this stuff or anything. Like, you have a lot of local power. Use that local power to see what you want to teach. And people have went to their school boards and banned CRT, whatever you want to call it. I know there's a couple counties that banned it, but you don't need to go all the way up to the governor to do like this weird blanket ban on all of it. Let people run their localities how they want to run it. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Freaking sweet. Leave it there. Thanks, guys. Good chatting with you.
All right.
All right, you too, man. Thanks.
Thank you. Later.